So Kim,
Yes.
tell us, what are we doing? Where are we?
We're on Norfolk Island and we're at Kingston. This is where all the settlements have been, and now we're going to learn about the history, I believe. I'm not quite sure. I can tell you after the tour.
Excellent.
But it's just absolutely gorgeous. Drop dead gorgeous place. The history's fascinating.
You need to know what we're looking at. What we're looking at is the Kingston and Arthur's Vale historic area in Norfolk Island, not the totality of Norfolk Island. And this area commences up this valley here. You come down from town and there's a dam at the bottom of the hill. You remember all seeing that driving around. From that dam area, in the valley, through this built-up area here, past Government House, past the cemetery, and around the corner to Bloody Bridge. So it's from that end to that end. It's then from the high water mark inland to the 90-metre contour. Now the 90-metre contour is basically what I stand here and see. It's the view shed area, basically, 90-metre contour. Now that's 225 hectares. 225 hectares is quite a large slice out of quite a small island. The convicts. I gave you some inkling about the convicts before. In other words, the people who were sent here were multiple offenders, or to be incorrigible. This is the end of the earth where you were sent. But all of these convicts were men. There were no female convicts of this era. Other era, yes, but not of this era. Another factor is that they were all multiple offenders. In other words, they did it more than once. Another is that the dominating age, this is really an interesting statistic, the dominating age of the people who were incarcerated here, the dominating, not the only, but the dominating age, was between 15 and 19 years. Now when you analyse it, 15 and 19 years incarcerated in a place like this, and once you're in the system, how do you ever get out of it? And some of the things were almost petty crimes. Pinching a loaf of bread. You know, the social statement is you pinch a loaf of bread to survive. I mean, there's social programs that look after people like that today, but they didn't exist in those times. And so you resorted to crimes and ended up in a place like this. Because you did it again and again, but it was to survive. And that's the social statement about it. But notwithstanding that age bracket, it wasn't the only age. I mean, for example, there was a fellow who was 105.
Oh my goodness.
105 is good today. It's magic almost to live to be 105 in those days. But that happened. Now this fellow was a forger. Thomas Salsby Wright was his name. He actually died here. He's in the graveyard. There's a headstone to him. So it's there to be seen. But Thomas Salsby Wright was a forger. But he was a multiple offender. He did it more than once. Yes, quite so. Yes, but he wouldn't be here unless you were a multiple offender. But he did it more than once. His last sentence, when he was arrested, mentioned he was tortured. He had in his possession £1 notes, £10 notes, £20 notes, but all his own manufacture. He made them, reduced them himself. Now at 102 for that, he got 14 years. Now he didn't quite see out his 14 years because he died at 105, but nevertheless that was what it was for Thomas Salsby Wright. I'm trying to think of the figure now, but it's close enough to illustrate the point, even if I haven't got the exact mark on it. Reasonably recently, at auction, in this part of the world, not in Norfolk Island, but in the Australian part of the world, one of Thomas Salsby Wright's £1 notes came up for sale. Guess what it went for?
Thousands?
Thousands? How many thousands? Lots of thousands. It went for 30,000 Australian dollars. That is for a dud £1 note. Well, somebody thought it was worth $30,000. We don't know. I don't know where it went. I've seen the note. It's a very, very nice note. The banknotes were bigger in those times. Very, very, artistically done. It was a neat piece of work. It was signed Thomas Salsby Wright. His signature was on it. It's probably a dealer, yes, in some way. But somebody thought it was worth 30,000. A brief word about the stone that's used, because obviously you see stone buildings everywhere. And the question is, where did the stone come from? Was it imported? No. It's all local stone. But you'll know that this island is a volcanic island. So there's been volcanic eruptions, lava flow. Lava flow solidifies into basalt. Basalt is hugely hard material. That stone sticking up there, that's a piece of basalt. And you see that in the cliff all around the place and in various other parts of the island. The buildings are not made of that basalt rock. It's too hard. The stone that is used is sedimentary rock from the Kingston area. Sedimentary rock, different rock. But there are two sorts of sedimentary rock that they used. The first was this rock that you see around the gateways, around doorways. You'll see the same stone as the baseline of buildings. You see it used as paving stones. If you've been to the cemetery, you'll see headstones that are made of this material. They use it for dripstones and the like. Now this is this material here, which is a close-grained stone. It's called massive gulcarinite, and it's local stone. Massive gulcarinite, and used in the way that I mentioned, around doors and windows, baseline of buildings and the like. But the rest of a building, whether it be a wall for a wall, or over here a wall for a building, it's a different sort of stone. This stone here. Now you can see this stuff is coarser grained, it's rougher material when you compare it to this. Massive gulcarinite, rubble gulcarinite. So two different sorts of stone. However, this rubble gulcarinite was then usually mortared over and then whitewashed or painted. But all of the mortar from these walls have now gone. This is not original mortar up here. This is bagging that's been put on to conserve what's underneath there and of more recent times. However, look at this building over here. This is the building that I mentioned to you that looks as though it's chopped off at the end. And that ran in a terrace to the toilet that I talked about earlier. Now that building is the same vintage as these walls. But there, if you look at the building, and you'll see painted brown, top and bottom of windows and doors. That's the massive gulcarinite. The rest of the wall is rubble gulcarinite. But there, the mortar's still in place, and it's painted. Yes, it's modern paint, but it's compatible paint. Now what that signals to us is that these walls, in their pristine condition, were like that. But what we see today is all of the mortar has now gone, and we see what is underneath it. This is too expensive to keep up. These are kept up because they're used. This is the mess room for the people who work in the area. The buildings down towards the pier, they are in the museum hands. So again, they're used and therefore they're kept in fairly good condition. But these and the hospital on the other side are not used. So obviously no money spent to keep them up. The benefit of what we see here is that we can see underneath, and we can see what the composition is. Whereas there, whilst it might look nice and is nice, we really can't see underneath. And they were out in the field until an hour before dusk, brought back and put in their cells. 2 meals a day. And that regime was 7 days a week. In those times, if you had a sentence, it was normally in multiples of 7. 7, 14, 21 years. You remember I mentioned Thomas Salsby Wright, he got 14 years? He's middle distance in terms of the sentencing arrangement. At the beginning of that time, you're normally issued with clothing. I think to call it a clothing allowance was probably a grand term, but nevertheless clothing, convict clothing. That would last you. your sentence of 7, 14 or 21 years. There are records of people observing convicts working in the quarries. You see the lone pine sticking up there on the other side? That is on the other side of Emily Bay, and there are quarries in that area. So observing convicts working in the quarries almost naked, because their clothes had rotted off them. Now we don't quite know whether that's the length of time that they had their clothes, or in fact the category of work that they were about. But you see, it's part of the inhuman treatment. I mean, today we can put on or take off layers. What if you had nothing all of the time, or almost nothing all of the time? That really was a bit more difficult. We'll talk about really inhuman treatment as we move along. Convicts in here. On the other side of the road, the hospital. You remember the hospital that I mentioned? And the surgeons' quarters, that brown building where we're sheltered on the veranda. Now, surgeons in those times didn't necessarily have a university education. You were apprenticed to be a surgeon. And so the surgeon would have a number of assistant surgeons learning to be a surgeon. If you were a convict here and you died, your body was taken to the mortuary at the back of this hospital, and the assistant surgeons would practice upon the bodies of the convicts, learning to be a surgeon. When you analyse it, that's not totally unlike what might happen today. The medical profession do have access to bodies, but not in the way that I'm talking about here, in a much more humane, obviously, way. But that's not what I'm on about. What I'm on about is this. With that process at the back there, for want of a better word, there is a human waste product. And that human waste product went from the mortuary in a stone-lined channel into the creek.
Oh no.
Now 100 metres along where that happened, here, there's a well. You can see the well, which is where this netting is around at this moment. Now on the other side of the wall, there is a channel dug in the earth which brings the water from the creek to this well.
Oh God.
The convicts who are here get their water from the well. So you can see in that sequence really different standards of public health. And I'm standing underneath the guardhouse here. And there's a row of cells on one side and there's a matching row of cells out here. This is the size of the cells. Now, people were smaller in those days, but nevertheless, this is still a confined space. This is the size. You didn't get a room to yourself, nor did you get a bed. It was either a mat, or if there was multiple occupancy, hammock style arrangement. Various cells in a row. A passageway that gave entrance. Notwithstanding an exterior security wall, each block of cells had their own containing wall. So that was the containing wall that contained this block of cells. They were back to back. Back to back. So another row of cells along here. Another passageway and another containing wall that really contained this room here. In the totality inside here in this compound, it was designed for something like 409 people. 409 people. The compound beyond, different style, for 600. So in round figures, 1,000 people, convicts. But we know from our records that maximum time there was something like 2,000 convicts here at any one time. All of these buildings built in a period of 30 years. That's a huge building programme. 30-year period, 1825 to 1855. At the beginning of this period, we talked about inhuman treatment, at the beginning of this period, that happened. And it happened, it was acceptable, but it was very much in-house. As time moved on in this 30-year period, people came, they saw what was happening, inspections happened, they saw what was happening. And it was gradually recognised that it was inhuman treatment. There were protests in the UK Parliament about inhuman treatment of convicts in Norfolk Island. And towards the end of that time, 1855, it was thought to be unacceptable conduct. And the imperial authorities were at that stage, when they'd reached that stage, just as happy for the so-called evidence to be erased. Now that's the first thread. The second thread is this. You remember those 4 settlements that I mentioned to you? The next that came along were the Pitcairners. Now they lived in Kingston, given grants of land elsewhere, encouraged to move to those grants of land, build their house and till the soil and become self-sufficient. Part of the incentive for them to move from Kingston to their grants of land was that they could recycle the stone from here. And that happened. Recycled the stone. But what about this? If you think about that, the most accessible stone is the wall. But the wall's still there. And why is that? And the answer comes when I tell you about those 2 sorts of stone that I explained to you at the front. The massive Kilcaronite, which I'm standing on, and the rubble Kilcaronite, which is that block there. Now, in here, all of the paving was the massive Kilcaronite. Surround of all of the doors was the massive Kilcaronite. The baseline of all of these buildings in here, massive Kilcaronite. So you can see this is the most valuable stone, and therefore this went first and reduced all of what we see to the rubble that we see today. Then they started on the wall. Now all of the wall is the rubble Kilcaronite, except the front gate. So it's the less valuable stone. So that came later. But once they'd reached this stage, then there was the thought, hey, it might have been inhuman treatment, but it was nevertheless part of the historical sequence. And we shouldn't be just cutting a stone off. And so taking of the stone was no longer permitted. But the taking of stone went until the 1950s. So reasonable recent times. And it obviously reduced to what we see. Owned none. But they gradually accumulated their own eating places. That can be like what we speak about. Maybe a shell or some other arrangement that would allow them to scoop their food or take their food by some method or another. And the commoner, as extra punishment, on one occasion confiscated all of their eating utensils. Now that annoyed them no end. They rebelled. They rose up and they killed their warders. Now that was really serious business. But let me pause on that to explain to you the levels of oversight. Remember that building chopped off? I mentioned there, overseers of the convicts, full constables. Now they were the daily warders who went along here and had oversight of them on a daily basis. So they rose up and killed their warders. That meant that long. But there's another layer of oversight. When that sort of thing happened, then the military were called out. The military from their barracks. Now that happened on this occasion. The military were called out, shot a number of the convicts, herded the rest of them back into their cells. 3 months later, the judge came, trial held. Those who were found guilty of this insurrection were hanged. And we know that they were hanged either inside here or on this wall here. That bit of it is not clear. And not on the same day. It was a longer trial, and it was over a couple of days. But it happened. It happened here. This really is just an example of what happened in terms of insurrections. It was serious business and usually ended up with people being hanged. That's well documented. But in a place like this, obviously, there are myths that occur from time. Any one time. And the civilians were a varied lot. But notwithstanding whether you were top of the tree or bottom of the tree in terms of the hierarchy in the civilians, because they were a very hierarchical arrangement, the basic design by the Royal Engineers for all of them was the same. In other words, we're talking about domestic architecture, where they lived. Front rectangle. They lived in the front rectangle, had their food there. Behind was a courtyard with walls on 2 sides. And at the other end, enclosing that courtyard, a row of buildings which provided the facilities. In other words, their kitchen, their toilet, their storerooms and the like. And that was the basic design, whether you're the top or the bottom. The difference between the top and the bottom, in other words, if you were at the bottom of the scale, you were very unimportant. If you were top of the scale, you really were important. It was the same design for all of them. The difference was the amount of space that you got. Now what we're standing here on is the area, this is that chopped off building, remember I talked to you, and I said it went to a terrace to that toilet. Now this housed the overseers of those convicts. These people were the bottom of the scale. These were not important people at all. Most of them were ex-convicts. They didn't have any standing. So this was their living space. Remember I said front rectangle, courtyard behind and a row of buildings. This was the front rectangle for them, here. This is the front. Front of the rectangle. This is the back. So this was their rectangle. I mentioned there was a terrace that went to the toilet. So this was repeated over there. In the centre of this was the hallway, here. And on one side of the hallway was a single room, which is what you see here. Where the big room are, along here. Now in this space here, it accommodated 8 men, hammock style, all the way. Another room here, another fireplace there, 8 men, hammock style. Behind this front rectangle here was a courtyard. You see this wall on either side? A modest size. And then behind, enclosing it, a row of buildings that had the facilities. The chimney for the kitchen, toilet and storeroom and the like. Not much space at all. Here, no space. 16 men accommodated in this area here. Then you terraced along and you had a repeat along here. So bottom of the scale in terms of the hierarchy. Further rising up the scale. Track our minds along Quality Road. Now you've seen the houses along Quality Road, you've driven along. You've probably seen the front rectangle at the front. Might be a bit hard to see what's behind, but it still has a courtyard and a building behind. Now looking at those houses along Quality Road, some of them will have at the front on the veranda 6 pillars. Not on the side, in the front. Now those houses that have 6 pillars have the same outline. There's a front rectangle. This is my last brag about the Royal Engineers. You can go away then and not have to put up with me any more about that. Remember, I said to you about the Royal Engineers. These are the people who designed all of the buildings. All of the buildings. They determined where they were placed. They had oversight of their construction. And the Royal Engineer, the principal person, he lived in Quality Road. He rode his horse to work. An engineer today, whether it be a Royal Engineer or a civil engineer, will obviously have transport. They need to make site visits. They'll have an office where they would plan whatever they needed to do, a bit of a car park. Well, the reality is that it wasn't much different in the earlier times when the Royal Engineers were here. They lived in Quality Road. The house that they lived in, just by way of example, had 8 pillars in the front, so kind of top of the scale for the Royal Engineers. Rode their horse to work. This little building group here was the office of the Royal Engineers. Now I mentioned to you that they rode their horse to work. The toilet block was the stable block that related to their office. Just as you'll have a car park today. You take your vehicle to work, park it, go into work, you then use your vehicle to go out on site visit. The same with them. Different sort of transport, however, horseback. And they provided for that in the context of things. The rest of the building was their office. Now I mentioned to you that they designed everything. When they designed something for themselves, they did it differently. And they provided some things that they provided to no one else whatsoever in the Kingston area. Look at the front and you will see a porch. No buildings in Kingston have a porch. None. They have verandas. Yes. But and many of them have verandas. But the verandas in all of the other buildings are of wood, including the pillars. This porch stands alone as a porch, but it's entirely of stone. The pillars are of stone. The entablature above is of stone. The roof is 3 blocks of stone. 1 entire block on one side and 2 blocks on the other. The roof itself weighs almost a ton. You don't see any of that anywhere. Look at the windows, front and side. And on top of the windows you'll see a protrusion of stone and scrollwork on either side. No other windows in any buildings at Kingston have that window arrangement.
Why wouldn't the government notice that and say, oh, like that on my window?
Because he wasn't a Royal Engineer.
But he outranked them.
In many ways he did. In many ways he did. But these are the people who have the technical expertise. If you look at the roof line, you will see the gabling. You see the gabling at the end of stone with a little bit of decoration at the end. Now look where I'm pointing now, and you will see it's a roof line the same, but at the end there is no stone lining. There's no stone gabling. Here it's not only in the front bit but also on the stable as well. You see all of that little compact arrangement, engineers. If you look at the chimneys, that is the 2 towards the front, you will see a bit more again, extension of stone and decoration of the stone. Compare those 2 chimneys where we were half a minute ago, over where the building's topped off. See how plain that is in comparison to what we've got here in the front. Inside the building are fireplaces. That's not unusual. All the buildings have fireplaces. In those times, fireplaces were not just to heat humans. They also needed to take up the moisture. And these buildings don't have damp courses.
You fell to the sea just off the coast of Aberdeen.
So if you like this video, what do you do, Kim?
Give us a thumbs up and subscribe. What way do you want?
I think over this way.
And subscribe.
Someone's got to give.
Excellent.